Hi everybody and welcome to webinar 22. Come on in, get yourself comfortable. Hopefully you can see us. We can't see you. If you would like to tell us who you are, where in the world you are, and what you've had for your tea, let's keep it simple. For everybody south of, I don't know, the Midlands, south of kind of Diana and Omar, you may have had your dinner. Tell us what you've had. So I have had my tea today, which is unusual. I picked up a takeaway, which is a little bit naughty, but I was very hungry and I had a really long day at uni. So
what did you have?
I had a chicken curry with a naan bread and a mixed starter. I bought my wife a curry as well, and not just like me. So she'll be on from work.
Thank you very much. So tonight is our 22nd webinar and we're going to be talking about the use of supervision tonight. We're joined by two guests who are going to go into the spotlight later. We've got Evelyn with us and we've got Vanessa, who actually is returning as a guest. So those of you who've been coming to every webinar might recognise Vanessa from our anti-racist webinar, but we've got we're joined by the two of them who are going to talk separately later on to share their experiences of receiving supervision. So tonight's session is, I think it's really important. It kind of follows on a little bit from last week's session when we were looking at passing practice placements. And one of the things that I think is really important is how you use supervision as a student, but then that goes through your whole career. So tonight we'll be looking at how we make use of supervision. But we will be looking at the what, the why and the how of supervision. And people who have been regular attenders will know that I always use the what, why and how framework in everything that I do, and I would suggest that you use it in everything that you do. The what, why, how framework is really helpful in terms of thinking through. Oh, we've got some noise coming in. I don't know where the noise is coming from. I'm trying to look at Omar. Do I need to do anything?
You're all good, Siobhan.
Okay, I'll keep going then. So the what, why, how framework is really important. What we need to be looking at when we're going out to see a family, we need to be looking at what is happening for this adult, this child, this family. Why has this situation come about? And how can we work together to improve outcomes? So what, why, how is a really helpful framework in everything that we do as social workers. The danger is that sometimes the why question falls off our agenda and it becomes very much what's happened, how am I deal with, how shall I deal with it, what's going on, how do I respond? That's very crisis driven, it's very managerialist, it's very proceduralized practice. But using the what, why, how framework for everything can just be really helpful. I would suggest it's a really helpful framework in terms of taking things into supervision. So what, why, how can be helpful for everything, and we're going to use what, why and how of supervision. So we're going to look at what is supervision, why is it important, and how do we do it. When we lose the why, our practice is problematic and it loses professional curiosity, it loses everything that is essential about social work practice. So I've talked to you, I think last week we looked at the golden circle when I talked about the importance of being clear about the purpose of what we do. And the purpose is all about the why, which sits at the centre of Simon Sinek's golden circle. So Simon Sinek talks about the golden circle. He's not a social worker. He is a leadership guru. And he says in the world of leadership, we need to know about the what, the why and the how. But he does it in a slightly separate order, with why sitting in the centre of what he describes as the golden circle. Now in supervision, we hear a lot of talk, not about a golden circle, but about a golden thread. So David Wilkins et al., based at Cardiff University, does a lot of research about the use of supervision in social work. And I would really, if you're interested in supervision or you're wanting to write about supervision, I would definitely recommend looking at Wilkins' research. But in one of the pieces of research, then Wilkins and his research team listened in to audio recordings of supervision in one local authority, child protection supervision. And to decide whether they thought the supervision was practice focused and helpful, they considered the following questions. So when they were listening in to the audio recordings, they listened in and reflected on, do we know what the social worker is going to do in the next home visit to this family or in the next few home visits? Do we understand why the social worker is going to do these things and how? So essentially what they were looking at was, has this discussion helped the social worker think more carefully about what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, and why they're going to do it? So you should really come away from every supervision session with a clear understanding of what you're doing with a family, why you're doing it, how you're going to do it, and maybe a reflection on how you think it's going to impact. So really the golden thread of supervision is this what, why, and how. So because this is so important and because it's a golden thread, then I'm using the what, why, and how to structure the session that we're going to do tonight. So we're going to start off by looking at what is supervision. Then we're going to look at why is supervision important in social work. And then we will conclude with how can you improve your use of supervision. So in terms of looking at the what, then the word supervision is originally taken from Latin, and it's used from the Latin. The word super is over, and the word vision is translated as seeing. So very often people will talk about supervision as overseeing. And actually that is where the history of supervision in social work lies. So back in the very early days of social work in this country, when we had caseworkers, we were called, rather than so early, the sort of early ancestors in many ways of social workers now were called caseworkers, and those caseworkers had overseers. So overseeing is the kind of historical way of looking at supervision. But in contemporary practice, it has to be about more than simply overseeing somebody's practice. So I would suggest what we do is we go back to that Latin, and instead of translating the videre as seeing or sight, we should think of the videre as vision. We should simply think of this as vision. It is called supervision after all, and it should be about vision. In leadership circles, leadership and management, then vision is seen as a key aspect of leadership, understanding vision. So understanding, having a vision, which is really about knowing what you want something to look like, knowing what outcomes you want. Having a vision, an aim, an outcome, if you like, is seen as key in leadership. So those of you that are based in England, we've got the professional capabilities framework. And the 9th domain of that is all about professional leadership. That's not about management. Leadership can be demonstrated by a first-year social work student. It's not about management. This is about having a vision. This is about supervision should help a worker to clarify their vision and to work towards it in practice. And that vision can be aided by the use of the what, why, how framework. So thinking through a vision should be, well, what does that look like? Why is that important? How will you get there? These are the kinds of questions that it's important for you to come out of supervision understanding. Where is it that you want to be with this service user, with this family, and how are you going to get there? Those things are really important. So supervision should enable you to clarify your vision for practice and to work towards that. That's what's really important. So that whole idea of going back to looking at what supervision is it's about your vision and someone helping you to develop that. But these are the objectives and functions of supervision. So if you were to read anything academic around supervision, then pretty much everything that's written about supervision academically talks about the functions of supervision, and it's generally accepted that there are 4 functions of supervision. These go right back to the days where Toni Morrison was writing about the 4 functions of supervision. Although different writers have written in different ways, then the functions generally are seen as being the same in supervision. So I've put those functions into a grid here because I thought it would be helpful for tonight to look at what are the objectives for supervision, which in many ways is the why. Why do we do it? The associated function, in some ways, I couldn't decide whether that's the what or the how, and I'm still a bit not certain if I've got it in the right way round, really. But the associated function is the kind of how we do it. And then what should you experience? So I've tried to put this into a grid to try and explain it. So why do we do supervision? We do supervision in social work to ensure competent, accountable practice. That's one of the reasons we do it. We also do it to make sure that we are encouraging continuing professional development of professionals. We also do it to offer personalised support, and we also do it to try and make sure that we're engaging the practitioner with the organisation, or possibly engaging the student with the placement. So that's all about engaging the worker. The associated function, so that goes with the why. So if we're doing supervision, as we do, to ensure competent, accountable practice, we do that through the managerial function of supervision. Some people refer to that as the accountability, the administrative, or the normative function. But that function of supervision essentially means that you should experience, either as a student or as a worker, you should experience space to discuss your practice and to reach decisions with support. You should experience a level of shared decision making so that it's clear where accountability for decisions lie. That's what you should experience. Another function of supervision is developmental, and that's the function which helps us to ensure continuing professional development. It's also referred to as the educative or the formative function. That means that workers should experience the opportunity for reflective discussions and conversations to enable their growth, their learning, and their development. The third function of supervision is the supportive function, sometimes referred to as the restorative function or the pastoral function. What this means is that as part of supervision, you should experience personalised support, so support to deal with the challenges of social work role. You should have space to discuss the emotional context of practice, how practice makes you feel. It's important, though, to recognise that there needs to be a balance here, and this is not a counselling session. Whilst you should be supported to think through the feelings that are that you have based on the work that you're doing, this isn't counselling, but that function should be there. Now, most supervision policies, if you're going to go out on a placement or if you're already a worker, most local authority supervision policies will refer to the first three functions: the managerial, the developmental, and the supportive function. They may not use those terms, they may use one of the others, but I've tried to give you in this grid all of the ways in which those functions might be described. The fourth function, I find, is very often missing from local authority policies, but the fourth function that is written about quite widely is the mediation function. Now, the mediation function is also referred to as the negotiation function, and essentially that function is about how the supervisor acts as the link between the person who's being supervised and the organisation. So if you like, that your supervisor acts as the link between you and the organisation. So what you should experience is your supervisor should have an understanding of your role and what you do and your professional role, but they should be able to help you to mediate the roles of, for example, a student mediating between being a learner but also being a professional, all the stuff you're learning at university and how maybe that does or doesn't fit into what's happening in practice. Your practice educator through supervision should help you to mediate those. As a professional and employee, your supervisor should help you to mediate where there are sometimes conflicts between your professional role and your employee status. So recognizing that you are a social worker, but you're also an employee of an organization, those kinds of how do we mediate some of the challenges in our roles, that's the mediation function. So what we have is 4 functions of supervision. Now, in my own view as a supervisor, you can't meet all 4 functions in a single supervision session. Although that's the way it's traditionally written about. It's traditionally written about you should come out of supervision experiencing those 4 things. I think the problem is that that leads in some ways to fairly poor quality supervision, that people feel I've met all of the functions. So sometimes what you'll get is you'll get a supervisor who throws in a couple of questions. So they might throw in something like, they'll start off with, and this is very common to start off with, how are you feeling? And then in the head, they'll tick off, I've done the supportive function, then that's done. It's not done by asking a single question. Likewise, partway through the supervision, you might be asked a question like, is there any training you've been on? Is there any training you'd like to go on? And then in their head, the supervisor is ticking off, I've done the developmental function. And then the rest of the supervision is all about how many cases have you got? Have you closed that? When are you going to do that by? The rest of it is all the managerial function. That does not mean that the functions of supervision have been met. It's not a single question that means that the developmental function has been met. You don't just ask, have you been on any training, and then you tick that off. It means that the whole supervision session should feel developmental. You should feel when you come out of supervision that you have learned and developed as a result of the supervision discussion that you've had the opportunity to reflect and to learn. So it's not about single questions being thrown in, but you should experience all 4 of those functions in supervision. So in the chat, I'm going to ask you to put in, do you recognize those functions of supervision? Are you receiving those functions of supervision in your own sessions? Now, my personal view is you can't meet, as a supervisor, I feel like I can't do all 4 of those functions in a single hour and a half, 2-hour supervision session. I don't feel I can do that. So the way that I do it is I look at the individual student or the individual practitioner, and I would rather work on the basis of that worker needs all 4 of those things. But I may not do all 4 of them in a single supervision. What might happen is I might make sure that that worker has some peer group supervision where they will feel supported and where they can do some developmental work. I will make sure that the individual supervision that I provide them with does the managerial and the mediation function. And there'll be some informal supervision as well, where we will discuss cases that will also meet the managerial function. So I would want to look at the individual and look at, are they getting all 4 of those functions? Some students in their placement portfolios are asked to write a reflection about supervision. A lot of newly qualified workers in their first year in practice, so particularly in England, I'm familiar with the ASYE documentation, but I know this is also relevant in other countries, but they might be asked to write a reflection about their use of supervision. I know in England, most newly qualified workers are asked to write about their use of supervision. It's worth you thinking about these 4 functions and widening out where you receive supervision from. So it's not about your single session, it's about your whole supervisory experience. And we'll come back to looking at that in a moment. But we're going to head over, and I am going to hand over now for a few minutes to our first guest for the spotlight this evening, and it's Evelyn. I don't know, I can just see your I can't see your camera at the moment. Evelyn, are you there and able to take over at this point? There you are, I can see you now. Fabulous. Okay, so if you want to put your microphone on and tell us what you want to share with us.
Hiya. So yeah, as it says, I've just graduated from Salford Uni. I am not an ASYE technically yet because I'm not qualified, but I'm on the programme. So I really wanted to speak to you all about my own experiences with supervision, coming from a student, like technically still a student perspective, and being new in practice. So for me, going into my first placement, I had no idea what supervision was. I didn't read a lot, which is really, it's a no-no, but yeah, I didn't know what supervision was. I didn't know what good supervision looked like. I didn't know what bad supervision looks like. I didn't know frequency. And at the time, my practice educator was my manager. So obviously there's power differentials in that I felt uncomfortable to say, oh, you know, we're supposed to have weekly supervision and we've not had it in however long. But yeah, so my first placement, I learned about supervision contracts, and I think a lot of us, we don't really know what to expect in that. So your supervision contract is something that is brought to you by your practice educator, and you are supposed to fill it in jointly. So it's a document that you use together, where you're both, you know, you're sharing your joint responsibilities, your roles, and then, you know, you put in there as well about your frequency of meeting, how long it's going to be for, you've got your agenda. And so it's a really good document where you both know your roles and your responsibilities, and you can both be accountable to each other. And I suppose it's kind of, while it touches on the managerial function that Siobhan was speaking about, because obviously it outlines your processes, the policies of the organisation, it's also about, oh, what's going on? Sorry, I'm seeing things pop up. It's also about, you know, sharing that responsibility and holding each other accountable, because it's really, it's your supervision. You are in control. You are a student, yeah, and you might feel powerless, but in that setting, it is on you to make sure you get what you need out of that supervision. And then, so moving forward, in that first placement, it was irregular supervision. I wasn't really happy about it, but as I said, it was power. It was a huge power difference, and I couldn't get myself to speak out. Luckily, during my second placement, I experienced and I was taught what good supervision should look like. And good supervision should leave you feeling motivated. It should leave you feeling knowledgeable, feeling supported, feeling like you understand what your role is, and what you need to do. You should also get support around, like, if you're not feeling challenged, because a lot of the times I think as students, well, for me in particular, I felt like I wasn't doing enough and I wasn't learning enough, and I just felt like, whilst it's good to be protected from a high caseload, because we've got work, uni work and life as well, I felt like I wasn't being pushed and challenged to use my theory in practice, and to use all the things that I'm studying in uni and actually do it in practice. And so I think having supervision, it's up to you then to say, well, actually, I've only got 2 cases and I'm not doing anything on them. Is there something else that someone has, another piece of work that they have that I can do? Is there, you know, shadowing opportunities? Is there, you know, training? What do you think is good for me as well? And also, if you use that space of supervision to say, well, actually, I read this article, or because we're in uni, so I realise that we know, as students, we actually know more about current practice and, you know, things that are happening in society, in theory, more than the practice educators and the social workers, because they've been in it for however long, do you know what I mean? And so it's up to us then to say, oh, do you know what, this is a new model that just came out, and this is a new article, and this is a new there's this training that's happening, not in the organization, it's elsewhere, but I think it would be really important. And obviously when you go on that training, you can use that as well to say, oh, I think, is it leadership, PCF?
Yeah.
9?
We have to be aware that that only applies in England, Evelyn, but yes, you're right.
Oh yeah, in England, my bad. So yeah, so you meet in your standards, your social work standards, and by going on training elsewhere, you can then feed that back into like your team meetings and stuff. So like that's 2 birds with 1 stone.
But thanks for sharing that, Evelyn. I think what I really liked there was you were talking about the importance of the contract, and I completely agree that the contract is key to setting things up in supervision. And it's really interesting that you've learned about that importance of the contract as a student, because you need to have a contract throughout your career. So thank you very much for sharing that. I think as well, you said you're going to send on some information that we're going to send out to people as well. So thank you for sharing with us.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So Evelyn there was talking about regularity of supervision. And one thing just to say, and again, I know people are from different countries here, but if you are a social worker in England, for example, then regularity should be that you should have minimum fortnightly supervision during your social work training, but really weekly. You should have weekly supervision as a student. Once you qualify and you go into your first year in practice and you're doing an ASYE in England, you should have supervision weekly for the first 6 weeks, then fortnightly up until the first 6 months, and then monthly after that throughout your career. So actually supervision should be regular for us through our whole career, and it's in, you know, having a contract that clarifies regularity is really important. So in terms of moving through the, I can't get the slides to move again. There we go. In terms of some of the things that Evelyn was talking about, and building on those a little bit, Evelyn was talking about the power dynamics, which I think are incredibly important in supervision, but also talking about sharing feelings and emotions. So if we think about the supportive function that I mentioned, despite the central importance of emotional support in supervision, it is one of the areas where social workers feel the most let down. That supportive function, a lot of social workers feel isn't there. And I would say at the moment, whilst we're working through a global pandemic and some of the real challenges that we're facing at the moment, it's essential that we feel that our supervision is a safe space to be able to take emotional issues and to be able to talk about feelings and emotions. So in a BASWA survey nearly 10 years ago now, 70% of respondents felt that the emotional issues that arise in their work weren't adequately addressed in supervision. So I want you to take a little bit of time now to think about whether you feel that supervision supports you in thinking through the emotional context of your work. Now, this is an old quotation, but one which I think is really important. So Hawkins and Shohart say that the supervisor's role isn't just to reassure the worker, but it's to allow the emotional disturbance to be felt within the safer setting of the supervisory relationship, where it can be survived, it can be reflected, and it can be learnt from. So the emotional challenges that you face in your work need to have space in supervision for discussion, because that's about the supportive function, but it's also about the developmental function. Having the opportunity to talk about the emotional context of your practice is essential. And so I want to just have a quick conversation with you about tears in supervision. And I think I want to say this because it does, for me, feel something that is really important. I have written a blog about this with a student that I was practice educator for over the summer, and you can find that on my website. We'll perhaps send the link out in the follow-up email that we send. But actually, tears in supervision are actually quite common. When we're going to be talking about emotions in supervision, it's quite common to cry. But across this summer, for the first time, I experienced providing supervision virtually. So it's all done through a computer screen, in the same way that our webinars are done through a computer screen, in the same way that I've never met any of the Student Connect team. Well, actually, I've met Kelly in person, but others I've not met in person, just through a computer screen. So I'd not met this student other than through a computer screen. And on one occasion, a few weeks into the placement, she was talking to me about something that she'd done. And I just said to her, "And how does that make you feel?" And she started to cry. And she felt terrible that she'd started to cry. If I'm honest with you, at that moment, I felt terrible because I didn't know how to deal with it. Most students that I work with at some point during their placement will cry. And I've said this for years in training that I do for other practice educators. In fact, a friend of mine said, you should stop saying that because they'll think you're doing things to students. But it's not about something I do. It's just about, I say to people, how does that make you feel? And you are going to be, if you've not been out on placement yet, you're going to be seeing things that are difficult. You're going to be challenged by difficult things. There's going to be aspects of moral injury that we've talked about, but you're also going to be tired. You're going to be dealing with, as Evelyn said, university work, as well as life, as well as everything else, all on top of one. And it can be overwhelming. And so tears are quite common. So when it happens, normally I shove my hand in my bag and I pull a tissue out and I pass the tissue to the person. I might go and make them a cup of tea, and I'll just sit with somebody, and often just sit in silence for a while in supervision. And that's all fine. And I'm very comfortable with that. But when this student started to cry through a computer screen, I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stuff a tissue through the computer screen. Every strategy that I'd ever used was gone. And I found that as a supervisor incredibly challenging. And it was a kind of pivotal moment for me in terms of how do we work remotely and so on. And actually, I won't tell you the whole of the story of that particular supervision session, but it is written about from both our perspectives in the blog. And I think it's worth reading. If you think that you've cried in supervision, or you might cry in supervision, it might be worth reading. But ultimately, I'll just tell you the story of, just to say to you that if you do cry in supervision, the reason I'm saying this is because I want you to feel like if your emotions do come through in supervision, it's not something to be worried about. Okay, you can't cry all the way through every supervision. You can't cry in every single supervision. But if you cry, it's not the end of the world. I think this student over the summer felt like she'd done something terrible because she'd cried in supervision. And you know, gosh, we're in a global pandemic. You're trying to manage everything all at the same time. It's understandable that emotions are there and emotions are heightened, and supervision should provide a safe place. But I ended up telling her the story to try and lighten the mood a little bit during this supervision after she'd stopped crying. I told her the story of someone who is now, I think assistant director or something, quite a high level. I never remember what the different levels are. And this is many, many years ago. And I was practice educator to this student. And I just said to her, like I normally do, I think I probably just said, how does that make you feel? And she started to cry, but it was a lot of tears. It was really snotty tears. It was, big, ugly crying. And I reached into my bag to get a tissue out, and I had no tissue. And I was wearing a scarf round my neck. I went into a complete panic. I've no idea why, but instead I couldn't find a tissue. They'd all gone. And I just handed her the scarf, and she blew her nose on this scarf and gave it back to me. And I thought, you can keep the scarf. I don't need the scarf back. And then afterwards, for quite a long time afterwards, she would send me a little scarf for Christmas every year, just as a bit of an in-joke about this whole scarf scenario. But the reason I'm telling you that is because it usually makes people laugh. It usually stays with people as a story. But it's to say, if you cry in supervision, it does not mean that you're not a good social worker. It doesn't mean that you can't deal with the emotional context of practice. It means that you are feeling something, and social work is about feelings. It's about emotions. It's about being a human being. And actually, that human to human thing should happen in supervision. Supervision should provide you the space to explore all of that human difficulty that we're dealing with as social workers. So emotions is important in supervision, and that's a key element of the supportive function of supervision. So I've kind of started to talk a bit about why do we have supervision in social work, because the functions of supervision are how we meet the reasons why. But why is it important for you to think about how to make the best use of supervision? Why is it important that we think about how do we make use of the supervision that's provided to us? Why a webinar on the use of supervision? Not on how to provide supervision, but how to use supervision. And the reason why is because supervision is a two-way process. I sometimes hear people say, oh, I got rubbish supervision. I don't get good supervision. You know, yes, there are some elements of that I'll say, okay, maybe if you're not getting supervision at all, or maybe some supervisors aren't very good, but actually supervision is a two-way process. Even the best, most skilled supervisor can't provide good supervision if you're not prepared to receive that, if you're not making the most of it. And there are some particular skills in receiving and making the most of the supervision that you provide. Supervision will always play a key part in your professional development. And don't forget, you've got the lead responsibility in that professional development. It's also about shared decision making and accountability. And also, supervision and resilience are very closely linked. It's one of the key elements of how you demonstrate and develop resilience as a social worker, is all about your use of supervision. So how do you make the most of the supervision that you're being presented with? How do you make the most of it? How do you play your role, if you like, in supervision? So I'm going to try and give you a few key pointers of what you should be doing. If you're a student going out onto placement, then take these pointers, because this is what your practice educator is going to be looking for. Certainly in England, your use of supervision is a key part of the professional capabilities framework. I know in Wales, it's a key part of the National Occupational Standards. So your use of supervision will definitely be being considered by your practice educator. As a qualified worker, your use of supervision is going to be being considered by your supervisor. So this is really important stuff. So you might recognize this slide from last week's presentation. It's not just about recycling slides. It is because, I mean, I've changed the wording on it, but it is because planning and preparation is so important. Now, I, as a practice educator, write into the learning agreements for the students I'm working with, I write in that students should be given the same amount of time to prepare for supervision as they spend in supervision. So I spend 2 hours in supervision with a student, I expect that they've been given 2 hours to prepare for that supervision, so that when I'm asking a student to do things, they should have the preparation time to do that. So you should feel able to talk about that in your agreements. How much time am I going to be given to prepare for supervision? That should be a key part of you talking and just asking that question. How much time do you have to prepare now? How might you improve your preparation for supervision? Think about those things. Preparing for supervision means you get the most out of it. Now, this illustration is another illustration that we've used in a previous webinar. And again, it's not about a recycling, but we've changed it slightly. So we did this to talk about journeys through social work. If you remember, we talked about the social work journey. But you'll notice that in that social worker's hand is the passport. For me, supervision is the passport for your social work journey, and we're going to explore that and what that means. It doesn't matter where we are on our social work journey. We all need to have good quality, emotionally supportive and reflective supervision. And I think now more than ever, supervision is the passport to our social work journey. So I'm going to ask you to think about the centrality of supervision in your journey. I want you to conceptualize supervision as if it was a passport, okay? You can't get very far without a passport. You can't go on a very long journey. You don't get to travel very far unless you have a passport. Much like supervision and social work, you can't go very far in social work without good quality supervision. It's key. And it's like a passport in many different ways. Firstly, it's unique. So just as a passport is unique to you and it's just your passport, it doesn't belong to anybody else, so is supervision. It should be a unique experience for you. I have supervised many, many people over my years in social work, not just students, but also qualified practitioners. And I would like to think that every supervisory relationship that I have developed is unique. It meets the needs of that individual. I don't just go around, this is how I do supervision and now you all need to fit in. I will adapt and I will look at what does this person need from this supervisory relationship and how will we manage that. So you learn, your contract, your supervision contract is key to looking at keeping this uniquely yours. Think about the origins of passports. You know, some people have two passports, don't they? They have like dual nationality. You need to think about how you're addressing aspects of culture and identity, particularly around diversity of those in supervision. I do think that Prosper Tedham's Mandela model is excellent for doing that. If you've not used it, have a look at Prosper's Mandela model to think about, because basically the Mandela model was developed as a way of looking at diversity in supervisory relationships. That's what it's all about. So think about who you are, who your supervisor is, the power dynamics that lie within that. The whole difference and diversity issue is important. If you're as old as me, you'll remember a time when you used to be able to get your passport stamped. They don't do it anymore, but when you went to different countries, they used to stamp your passport to show you'd been there. I kind of think of a passport, a supervision passport, can be stamped in lots of different places. You can have formal supervision with your nominated supervisor, who, if you're a student, will be your practice educator. If you're a social worker, will be your line manager. But you can also get supervision from other places. So sometimes students will also have a practice supervisor. They'll get supervision there. Sometimes social workers can have supervision both with their line manager and with perhaps a, I don't know, sometimes there'll be an ASYE coordinator, or sometimes there'll be a senior practitioner that just provides reflective supervision. Or so there's a whole range of different people that you can have supervision from. So think about your passport being stamped in lots of different ways. Passports cost a fortune nowadays. I didn't realize until I had to renew mine last year how expensive they are. You know, the worth of a passport is huge. You need to think about, are you recognizing the worth of supervision? Supervision is worth its weight in gold. Good supervision provides you with so much support. It provides you with so much safety. Good supervision is worth its weight in gold, and you need to recognize that. I'd also ask you maybe to think about the state of your passport. You know, is it like when you get a brand new one like I've now got, it's not flexible, it doesn't move, it's very hard. When you've had a passport for ages, it gets really tatty around the edges, and it's, in a way, think about what's your supervision history. Are you flexible in your use of supervision? Have you had lots of supervision, or are you very new to this? And if you're very new to this, you do need to, as Evelyn said, she said, I didn't really know what supervision was. Well, you don't go on placement not knowing what supervision is. You know, explore it, think about what supervision is, think about how you're expected to prepare for supervision, what you need to take to supervision. So that takes us into the kind of the visas and the additional documentation that you need. Do you arrive for supervision with all the documentation that you need? Have you ever been on a journey when you stood behind someone who's rifling through their bags when they get to the, you know, the checkout, and they can't find the passport and they can't find the bits of paper they need, the boarding pass and all that? It's a nightmare. Don't turn up for supervision trying to, like one of those people rifling through your bags to try and find everything. Turn up organised. You need to be able to travel. You need to have your passport and your visa in place. And then the final thing I'm going to ask you about your passport is I want you to imagine now in your mind's eye, and you can put it in the chat if you want to, I want you to imagine what's your passport photograph look like. I have never met anybody yet who wants to blow up their passport photo and stick it on the wall in the front room. Nobody does that. There are so many rules and regulations about what you can and can't do on a passport photo that it feels like it's no longer you. It doesn't actually look like you. And in a way, sometimes that's like social work. There's so many rules and regulations. Is it still you doing this social work? So think about your passport photo now. Conjure it up in your mind. What does it look like? Now, to me, my passport photo doesn't look like me, but it probably does look like how other people see me, but maybe it's not how I see myself. But I want you to think about passport photos. And on the next slide, I'm going to share with you a bad passport photo. Now, my thoughts were, I thought, do you know what? I'm going to go on Google Images and I'm going to get a bad passport photo that's going to make us all laugh and cheer us all up. But actually, that's not what you get. When you go on Google Images and put bad passport photo, that's not what you get. What you get is advice on how to take the right kind of passport photo. And the image that I'm going to share with you now comes from the Algerian embassy. It's actually from the Algerian embassy, and it's their advice on how to take the right kind of passport photograph. And it captured me straight away. And this is the image that captured me when I did the Google image search. Bad passport photos was this one. Jumped out at me straight away, partly because it's quite cute. But it says, and the Algerian embassy says, you must not have your mouth covered by your hands. You must not have your eyes closed, and you must not have an unnatural facial expression or crying. And that image came up and it attracted me straight away, partly because it's quite cute. It sort of drew me to it. Partly because I was thinking when I looked at it, well, that's a bit like a day in social work, really, isn't it? You kind of start off with your, oh, I'm not sure. And then you're halfway through, oh, I don't know about this. And then by the end of the day, you're crying. It could feel like that. Could feel like a placement. You start off like that, you end up like that. I mean, literally what that demonstrates is the emotional context of what we do. The reason that we need to have this good quality supervision, the reason that we need to prepare to use supervision is because it has to provide us with that space, that emotional context to think about and reflect on the emotional context of practice and to develop our thinking. Getting the balance right can be a challenge so that this doesn't become a counselling session. You don't take all your personal problems into supervision. It's get the balance right. It does have boundaries and it needs to have boundaries, but supervision should be emotionally supportive. And the other reason that that image attracted me was because it's not quite, but it could almost be see no evil, speak no evil, hear no evil. And that kind of reminds me of the whole aspect of whistleblowing. And if the supervision that you receive is so poor, then you need to whistleblow about that. Because if something were to happen, for example, if a regulator was to, there was to be a fitness to practice thing and you were to say, well, I didn't have any supervision, the question would be to you, well, what did you do about that? Supervision is your responsibility. It's not something that's done to you. Supervision is a shared responsibility. So if it's so poor, you need to talk about that. You need to think about whistleblowing procedures. And so we're going to go on to our second guest of tonight, Vanessa, who is a qualified worker, who's going to talk to us about, you're going to talk to us, aren't you, Vanessa, about your experiences of supervision. So thank you. I shall mute myself and we're over to you for a while, Vanessa.
Okay, hello, can you hear me? Great, okay, so I've been qualified for coming up to almost 4 years now. So my first kind of experience, I work in child protection, by the way. So my first experience of supervision was quite poor, to be honest. And I think what you find is that when a local authority is doing really well, supervision is really good. But when caseloads are skyrocketing and everyone's overwhelmed, sometimes supervision can be quite poor. So when I first started, I think I spoke about this on the last webinar as well. So, you know, I didn't have a manager, so my supervision was quite inconsistent in terms of decision making. Whenever I came out of that supervision, I didn't feel any kind of like wiser or clearer about the decisions that I was supposed to do, like to make really, or how I should kind of move forward. Every time I kind of felt confused really when I came out of that supervision. But since then, you know, things have really improved. They've really improved and everything's going really well at the moment. And what I find is that for me, supervision kind of provides me, you know, the space and an opportunity to be kind of, you know, critically reflect on the decisions that I've made in practice, but also how, you know, things that have gone really well, things that haven't gone so well, how we can kind of move forward and what can we do. You know, for obviously being based in child protection, for me, it's about the better outcomes for the children and families that we work with and that we're supporting. And that also includes sometimes your manager kind of just pulling things together and saying, well, we've done this, we've done that, okay, how can we be more creative about things? And that's what I kind of like about supervision. So in terms of just being more curious, being more creative in your approach, but also I think sometimes for me, supervision does kind of help you to kind of identify, you know, certain issues and address key issues as well. How I kind of approach supervision for me is I always kind of prep. So, you know, at the moment we're going through a phase of kind of doing supervision weekly, whereas before it was fortnightly, and then, you know, you'll talk about almost all your cases, which is not quite helpful because you're not getting the time to think, you know, carefully about each and every individual family and every child within that family or within your caseload. So at the moment, we're doing weekly supervision where you only talk about 2 cases. So when I'm doing my prep, you know, I kind of go back on my last maybe 3 or 4 visits, you know, what has been going on? Has something changed? You know, what am I thinking about this case? What can I do differently? Or actually, you know, what else do I think could be better for this family to improve the outcomes? But also, if I'm feeling quite stuck, you know, I tend to kind of journal as well, and I put it in my my prep notes in terms of I feel stuck because, you know, maybe I've had this case for coming up to a year now, but we're not improving. What else can I do? So for me, when I got in supervision, it's about being quite reflective in my approach and in terms of like my decision making moving forward. But also, I think at times, you know, supervision can be quite overwhelming when you do feel stuck. And I think it's about you being open and honest with your, whether it's your manager, whether it's your mentor, or it's an advanced practitioner within your team, and saying, look, you know, I'm feeling quite overwhelmed. I'm not sure how I feel about this case. And that way, sometimes it can really just help to just kind of explore everything. Why are you feeling the way that you're feeling at this moment in time about a particular case that you have on your caseload? So just for me, really, like in terms of the case supervision, I do think it's really important for you to be honest and be open and to be, you know, to prepare, and that is your responsibility. I think, as Siobhan said earlier on, sometimes, you know, managers do also get overwhelmed, things are not going right, but also, you know, look at their calendar and actually you're feeling stuck about this case, then actually book in something in their slot and say, we need to have a chat about this case because I'm feeling stuck, I'm not comfortable with what's going on right now. And I think that's obviously your leadership skills coming in as well. But I will say that can kind of take time as well, because it took me, you know, at least a year to kind of get there where, you know, I'm quite confident to do that with my manager or my mentor when I was doing my SYE. But in terms of just, sorry, I have made some notes, but I think moving forward for me as well in terms of personal supervision. So in the local authority that I work for, we do case supervision, but then we also have personal supervision. And that is around, you know, your emotional resilience, because like as Evelyn said before, you know, we've got life. If you're a student as well, you know, you're trying to manage your essays and all of this, but also in just, you know, we're in the middle of a pandemic as we speak right now, and that personal supervision is just really key around your emotional resilience. How are you feeling? How can we help? And I think sometimes, you know, you may not always know about local authorities. Do you have the support, whether that is things that you don't want to talk about with your manager in terms of you feel actually my manager is the issue? There are other people that you can talk to, but also there are wellbeing services that are available within your local authority or even within your university. For me, how I have used sorry, I've just seen what Samantha has just said. So it can be quite difficult in terms of kind of managing that work and life balance. So how I have managed my personal supervision is, you know, I'm quite passionate about anti-racism, FGM, and so many other things, even just kind of having that child-centered approach. And it's about you being open and honest about, you know, I'm passionate about this. I want to do this. As opposed to your manager saying there's a training available. It's about you actually going ahead and saying, I want to do this, or maybe in the next 2 years, this is what I want to do. Then, you know, that way your manager can also share resources with you to kind of enable you to move, you know, towards your goals in terms of your career. But also, I think for me, personal supervision is a chance for you to just be open and honest. If there are things that you're struggling with, you know, bring that into supervision, talk about it. But also in terms as well, your welfare needs, your emotional well-being, like I said earlier on. So I think, you know, against how you use your supervision. And as I said before, it is difficult when when you first start, when you're newly qualified or you're doing your SYE, but honestly, it's about you being more assertive as well and asking for that. It is your right. And every local authority has a policy around supervision. So if it's not happening, you know, even if it's a quick email that you send to your manager, I need to have a chat with you about this. And I do think that's where the kind of the strength-based practice comes in, and that relationship with your manager as well comes in. And I think, you know, as time goes on, your manager will have a good insight into how you are as a person. And that is really helpful sometimes, because when I first started, you know, a manager would say to me, oh, when do you think you're going to get this done? And I would say, oh, by the end of this week. But that's not realistic. And my manager sometimes is able to kind of pull that back and say, no, actually, Vanessa, you can't get it done. But what I've noticed in the last few years now, you know, when my manager is saying to me, when can you get it done? I say, you know, to be honest with you, I can't do it this week, maybe on Monday next week. And it's just that kind of you being, you know, being more aware of who you are as a professional, what can you manage and what you can't manage. And I think also being honest in what you can manage. So there is times where, you know, I've had a lot of cases and I just couldn't manage anymore. But because I was kind of like newly qualified, I didn't have the confidence to say, I'm struggling, I can't cope anymore. And we know what happens when you then, you know, are burning out, basically. And I think it's about you having that insight into yourself, and you kind of, however you want to say that to your manager, basically. I found that quite really helpful over the last 2.5 years in practice. So yeah. Trying to think, is there anything else that I've not covered in my experience? No, I don't think so.
I think what's fabulous there, what you've shared with us, Vanessa, is it kind of illustrates that actually every local authority does supervision differently. And of course, social workers are not all employed in local authorities either. There'll be other organisations. Sure. And everywhere does it differently. I think it's fascinating that your local authority does this, separates it out, personal supervision and case supervision. And that now during the pandemic, I think it's fabulous that we've changed ways of working, and the real kind of pressures that are on all of us, that they're doing weekly case supervision, and you'd bring in 2 different cases each week, because that means you can go into depth more, you can be more reflective in those conversations. So thank you so much for sharing that. I also think it's great that you're saying be more confident, because when we start off, as you were saying, you're not as confident, and when you grow in confidence, it's your supervision, isn't it, Vanessa?
Absolutely.
You make it. Yeah,
it's what you make it. And as I said before, it is difficult when you first start, but also, you know, I'm not sure in terms of other local authorities, but where I work, we also have, you know, advanced practitioner. So you may not always feel kind of comfortable, you know, approaching your manager, but then you can approach maybe an advanced practitioner on your team or available to within the local authority. But how can I approach this? What can I do? So, you know, it's about what's available to you, the resources, and if you don't use them, you know, then you're not just taking advantage of the opportunities available. But yeah, I think that's everything from me.
Thank you. Thanks, Vanessa, and thanks for sharing your wisdom with us again. That was fabulous. Thank you. So we're going to move towards concluding the session now. I'm going to talk about something a little bit different to supervision. I'm going to just mention intervision. So we talked earlier about supervision and what does it mean, and looking at it, seeing vision as being about where we want to get to. So I suppose if supervision is a kind of overseeing of your vision, of your idea, of your movement, intervision could be roughly translated as between vision, between seeing. And basically intervision is significant in other countries in social work, not used very much at all in the UK in social work. And it describes the process of a group of professionals coming together to discuss work which they're finding emotionally challenging. So the discussion groups promote peer critical reflection around an in-depth, compassionate listening and exchanges which recognise the emotional context of the practice. So this isn't like a group supervision where someone brings a case and talks about it and everybody throws in suggestions. It's a much more nuanced coming together of a group of professionals to talk about the emotional context of the practice. It's about a mutually supportive exchange and a challenge between professionals who are equal. So it gets rid of this power dynamic and the power imbalance that I think people get concerned about. And once or twice when the guest speakers have been speaking, I've looked at the chat and there's been aspects of chat around power. So in intervision, there's no hierarchy. Although sessions need to be chaired and they need to be recorded in order to support learning, those roles are shared and they're rotated and taken in turns. So intervision, as it says to you there, it's more popular in other professions in the UK, but there is a growing recognition now of the use of intervision in social work, and particularly in practice learning and practice education. So again, we'll send you some resources to the research on that area. There is a really good paper which is written about, not about social work supervision, but it's written about supervision of professionals who work in drugs and alcohol, and it's written by the United Nations. And I found it a fascinating paper to look at what a worker needs. So it's a paper from 2010, but it looks at, maybe I was attracted to it because it's kind of the way I look at things. So I said to you earlier, I look at the worker and look at those 4 functions of supervision and where are they getting it from. And in a way, this paper, the intervision guidelines from the United Nations, almost do the same sort of thing. So they look at the worker and they look at the worker needs to have 4 things. The worker needs to have case discussions. So that direction of work, that shared decision making, they need case discussions. They need team meetings. They need supervision, but they also need intervision. And it breaks it down, this document. So if supervision is something you're interested in, this document is something you'll find useful. But team meetings cover the core themes of management issues. So they're all about kind of facilitating what's going on, but they're the managerial, administrative functions go on in team meetings. Case discussions focus on an individual case and should include all of the staff that are involved to reach an agreement on the intervention plan or to evaluate progress. So sometimes case discussions won't be with a single person. It might be with a group of people if they're working with that particular family. And then intervision and supervision, according to these guidelines, are both forms of work-related learning. They aim to improve the quality of the work of professionals, and supervision and intervision have a number of shared and common characteristics. Both of them should focus on the learning and the development of staff. They should aim at increasing the knowledge, improving the skills, increasing the self-reflection and the insight into personal function and how to deal with the emotions that relate to work situations. Supervision is individual and guided by a supervisor. Intervision is within a group of equals. What I find really interesting there, though, is if you look at how it describes what supervision and intervision are, that's what you should be getting from supervision. And yet what many people say they experience is case discussion, not supervision as a wider area, not supervision that covers all of the functions of supervision. So I would suggest to you that there are people that we as a team greatly admire in terms of supervision. And one of those is Shabnam Ahmed, who spoke at our webinar 10 and shared the 6 R's of supervision. Shabnam's YouTube channel is brilliant. I would definitely advise everybody to take a look at that. It's the School of Shabs is the YouTube that's what the title of the YouTube channel is. I think probably the team will put the details into the chat for you now. But for example, Shabnam is, I think, an exceptional supervisor. All the team keeps saying to me, oh, we need a supervisor like Shabnam. But look at some of those kinds of videos and maybe share some of those with your supervisors. You know, there's an increasing amount of literature and material available about good quality supervision. Look at it. Recognize that, just as Joe said last week, you know, we said last week in the session I did with Joe, we said, this is your placement, shape your placement. Well, this is your supervision and you need to shape your supervision. That's really important. So I think we've said and explored the fact that supervision is a shared process. It's two-way. It's not a single thing. It's not something that's done to you. You know, you could have the best supervisor in the world, and if the person doesn't engage in supervision, it's going to be terrible supervision. So it's a shared process. You need to make sure that you use it effectively, and that's all about you. Use what you get and use it well. Prepare. Make sure you prepare, take some notes, think things through. What do you want to get out of supervision? What do you want to know at the end of that conversation? Why is that important? How will you use it? Use your what, why, how framework to think it through. Take emotions to supervision. Talk about emotions. Emotions have a huge impact on what we do as social workers, and you need to find the space to talk about emotions in supervision. You also need to be able to reflect in supervision. It's the key aspect of good quality supervision, is that you take your reflections, you think it through. Values. Within supervision, you need to be exploring your values. You need to think about ethics. You need to think about those values and ethical dilemmas and discuss and share those within supervision. It's all about identity. One of the things I said to you earlier was, think about, in terms of your passport, think about your identity, who you are, who your supervisor is, how you connect, what are the differences between you, how are they managed effectively. Solution focus. Now, I've not really talked about this tonight, but one of the key things, if I was providing supervision training on how to do supervision, I would be talking a lot about making sure that supervision is solution focused. One of the things that supervisors talk about a lot is that the people they supervise come to them almost saying, here's all the information, I'll throw it at you, now tell me what to do. That is not how to use supervision. A good supervisor will help you to find your own solutions to the difficulties that you're experiencing, will help you to reach decisions in a shared accountability way. But supervision will be all about solutions. You need to go into supervision ready to explore solutions, not going in there looking for answers. This is not about problem solving. This is not about going to someone and then them telling you what to do. This is about you working with your supervisor to find solutions to the difficulties. Think about intervision and the growing popularity of intervision. It's well worth exploring. It's well worth thinking about as a student, particularly with the pandemic at the moment. How about suggesting to your practice educator that you could set up an intervision group, either within the team or maybe with other students, or you know, take a lead in suggesting intervision, do a bit of research around it, bring it into teams. Intervision can be really helpful for people. Think about outcomes. Supervision should focus on outcomes for the service users. What's this all about? What are we actually looking for? That's what supervision is. We are here to support people. That's what it's all about. So think about outcomes. And then finally, think about the notes. Note taking in supervision is really important. As a practice educator, what I tend to do is take it in turns to take notes so that the student will learn to note take in the supervision sessions. So think about how are notes kept. Are you getting the notes of supervision? Are you making sure that you sign the notes of supervision? Notes of supervision are very important. And again, this is why I think case discussions should be separated out. In my view, case discussions should be recorded on the service user's file, whereas supervision notes are yours because they're about you and your growth and your development, and they can be used for your own learning and development. So this is about how do we separate out notes, how do we think about note taking, and make sure that you outline that in your supervision contract. So you'll have noticed, if you take a look, that all of those words spell out supervision. And really, we wanted to just tonight talk about the importance of you understanding what supervision is, you thinking about why supervision is important, but why should you take a key role in this? And then how can you improve your own use of supervision? So I want you to take something away from tonight's webinar. What are you going to do differently in terms of your use of supervision as a result of tonight? Just one thing, even if you do one thing differently as a result of tonight, and maybe commit to that in the chat. Write down what you're going to do differently as a result of tonight, and it might be because of something that Evelyn said, or something that Vanessa said, or something that we've run through in terms of the background of tonight's webinar. But try and write down something that you are going to do differently in terms of your own use of supervision. And the reason I'm asking you to share that and commit to that in the chat is because I'm finding now, as the webinars are progressing, that the chat is so valuable, and the practice wisdom that comes through in the chat is amazing. And we'll send that chat out. So someone else might commit to doing something that you think, actually, when you read it, you think, you know, I could do that as well. And that could be really helpful. So we could spread out some of the kind of learning around how we can use supervision. So supervision, very often people go into supervision just ready to talk about what they're doing, what's happening on this, what's happening on that, what case is going on here, how many more things I can do. We go in with that mindset, and some supervisors will look at supervision as being purely about what are you doing, but actually supervision should focus much more on what lies behind that. And what lies behind what the practitioner does is why they're doing it and how they're doing it. We need to move deeper from what am I doing to why am I doing it and how am I doing it. And the how should even extend into, and how is that impacting on the people that I'm working with. This is really important, digging down beyond the what into the why and the how. And that is a joint responsibility. That can't happen just by a supervisor doing something. This has to be a joint responsibility. You must take an active role in the supervision that you experience. It's a key aspect. It's your supervision, and you need to think about how you are going to use it. So hopefully tonight has given you some things to think about, but we hope that that will continue on for you. Now, you will know that I started the webinars with the team because of the coronavirus lockdown in England, and we are going into what's being described as a second lockdown as from, I think, tomorrow. And I know other countries have been locked down for longer. So it means we're going to continue the webinars through, and we have a number of really exciting sessions coming up. Unfortunately, I had got myself muddled, so last week I gave you these in the wrong order, but next week we are going to be looking at digital safeguarding. We're going to look at the theory and the practice of digital safeguarding. Now, I am dreadful at that, so I am really looking forward to learning there from Debbie Greaves, who is going to be joining us to deliver that session next week. The following week, we're going to be looking at relationship-based practice, and we're going to be looking at particularly the endings of relationships, because that's something that I think is very often missed. It's almost like we're starting at the end, but that's really important. But we're not doing endings because we are ending the webinars. We will be continuing the webinars, and the following week, we will be looking at age assessments with a lawyer. So we have some really exciting sessions coming up. I hope the team are putting into the chat now the registration link for next week. What that means is that you can register now, ready for next week, and then you know you've got your registration set up. We know that we are getting a lot of emails to the webinar email address asking us for the registration link, and we get that a lot. Now, you know that we're doing this all in our own time, and you know, students are now busy. They're all off going out on placement soon. For Becky starts placement soon, Omar does soon, Diana will soon. Chris and Kat are in their jobs now. So we're all very busy. So we're trying to do things in a way which creates as less work as possible. And so when you email the webinar's email address, you get an automatic reply. The automatic reply will have the link in for the following week. But then people keep emailing us saying, please send the link, please send the link. And they keep getting the automatic email and still emailing us back to say, please send the link. And then they want a detailed email from us. We don't have the time to do all of that every week. So you will get an auto reply, and that auto reply will have the link for the following week. It's always there. It's always ready. We try and make it as easy as possible for everybody to register. So the link is there ready now for next week. And then beyond that, then we will be, you'll be able to get it from the webinars at kerwinmclean.co.uk email address. So is there anything that anybody else wants to say tonight before we close the session? Am I just going to hand over to somebody on the team? Go on, someone on the team say something, and then we'll close the session for tonight, because I've not seen the chat, so I don't know what people are saying. Who's going to say something? Don't leave me all on my own. I don't want to put anybody on the spot. Go on.
There was somebody in the chat, Siobhan, who said that this is like PE with Joe Wicks for social workers, and it just really made me laugh. I just think that's one of the best comments we've ever had.
Like a workout, like a weekly workout.
We'll take that.
Yeah.
I love that, especially because I tried once to do the Joe Wicks PE workout. I ended up on the floor and thought, I just can't do this. It's just beyond me. So that's quite tickled me.